Fresh satellite imagery this year showed something the Pentagon had been dreading for months. Dozens of small, fast Iranian boats forming up in tight clusters near the Strait of Hormuz, the 20-mile-wide choke point through which a huge share of the world's oil still has to pass. No massive warships, no aircraft carriers, just hundreds of tiny, cheap, fast vessels scattered along the coastline, hidden in tunnels, ready to move within minutes. And according to U.S. defense officials, that may be the single hardest naval threat America has faced in the Persian Gulf in a generation. Because you cannot sink what you cannot find, and you cannot find thousands of boats that were built from day one to disappear. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back decades to a war most people barely remember. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iran discovered something painful the hard way. Its regular navy, built around a handful of larger frigates and destroyers, was outgunned and slow. So Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, built something completely different. Instead of a handful of expensive ships, they built swarms. Hundreds of small, armed speedboats that could dart out from the coastline, fire, and vanish before anyone could respond. It became known as swarm tactics, and it has been the backbone of Iran's naval doctrine in the Persian Gulf ever since. That old idea is exactly what's back on the table right now in 2026, and it's the reason this story matters. Because what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz today isn't some isolated incident. It's the latest chapter in a war that began, according to BBC News, on the morning of 28 February 2026, when the United States and Israel carried out a joint operation inside Iran that killed the country's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, at his office in Tehran. Khamenei had ruled Iran for nearly 40 years. His death was one of the most consequential targeted killings in modern Middle Eastern history, and Iranian state television confirmed it on 1st March, according to Al Jazeera, which reported that Iran then declared 40 days of national mourning. President Trump warned Iran directly not to retaliate against American or Israeli forces, a warning covered at the time by The Independent. Within days, according to Wikipedia's detailed sourced timeline of the conflict and corroborating wire reporting, Iran's parliamentary speaker and senior officials were signaling that any retaliation would come. And it did, but slowly and largely at sea, where Iran still had cards left to play. Because here's the thing that made this war different from previous flare-ups between Washington and Tehran. According to Fox News, reporting from April 2026, citing U.S. military assessments, more than 155 of Iran's larger naval vessels, frigates, corvettes, bigger surface combatants, were sunk during the opening weeks of the war. Iran's conventional blue water navy was, for all practical purposes, gutted. But that's exactly the piece of Iran's military that was never the centerpiece of its Gulf strategy in the first place. So what was left? The speedboats. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because nobody, not even U.S. intelligence, seems totally sure just how many there are. Farzin Nadimi, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, told Fox News in April that if you count everything from the smallest skiffs up to the more capable fast attack craft, the total could reach 3,000 to 4,000 vessels. Of those, he estimated, somewhere between 800 and 900 are capable of carrying anti-ship missiles, meaning they're not just harassment boats, they're actual strike platforms. Read that number again, up to 4,000 small boats. That is not a fleet in any conventional sense. That's a distributed, almost impossible to count threat, deliberately designed that way. And Iran didn't just leave these boats sitting in open harbors waiting to be bombed. According to Nadimi's assessment, many are stored in hardened underground tunnel complexes carved into the coastline and the islands near the strait, Keshem Island among them, a location that has come up repeatedly in CENTCOM strike reports. Some boats, he said, are launched directly from these tunnels into the water. Others sit on trailers inside dry tunnel networks, ready to be towed out. And in some cases, according to that same reporting, boats have reportedly been dispersed into ordinary civilian buildings along the coast, structures large enough to physically hide a fast attack craft from satellite and drone surveillance. This is a fleet built from the ground up to survive exactly the kind of air campaign the United States has already thrown at it. Now here's where the U.S. military's response gets genuinely interesting, and where the sent back part of this story starts to take shape. On 13th of April 2026, according to Wikipedia's sourced entry on the 2026 United States naval blockade of Iran, the United States formally imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, following the collapse of a round of negotiations known as the Islamabad talks. The stated goal was straightforward: choke off Iran's ability to move oil, and by extension, choke off the money funding the war. CENTCOM reported by 18th of April that it had intercepted 23 vessels attempting to move through or around the blockade line. Lloyd's List, the shipping industry's own tracking service, separately reported that by 23rd of April, at least 26 ships had managed to slip past the blockade in both directions, a detail worth noting because it shows two different organizations, one American and one independent, telling a slightly different version of how tight that blockade actually was. The first direct military action of the blockade came on 19th of April, when the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, working with the destroyer USS Spruance, seized an Iranian-flagged vessel called the Tuska, according to Wikipedia's sourced blockade timeline. Iran's response on 18th April was to close the Strait of Hormuz again, this time explicitly in retaliation for the U.S. refusal to lift the blockade. And that's the moment the fast boat story really starts moving from background threat to active confrontation, because a closed strait and a naval blockade sitting on top of each other means American ships, commercial tankers, and Iranian speedboats are all suddenly operating in the same tight, dangerous corridor of water. By early May, the pressure on Iran's economy was becoming impossible to ignore. The U.S. Department of Defense estimated, according to Wikipedia's sourced entry on the strikes of 7th May 2026, that the blockade had already cost Iran close to $8 billion in lost oil revenue by the 1st of May. On 3rd May, the United States launched what it called the second stage of the war, an operation named Project Freedom, planned by U.S. Central Command, with the explicit goal of militarily escorting merchant vessels through the strait. According to Wikipedia's sourced summary, the operation resulted in 7 Iranian boats being sunk, and a French container ship operated by CMA-CGM was hit during the fighting. Trump paused the operation briefly on 6th of May, saying there had been great progress toward what he called a possible complete and final agreement with Iran, a pause that notably didn't last. Because on 7th of May, according to Wikipedia's sourced timeline, the United States carried out fresh airstrikes on southern Iran and on Tehran itself, striking in what U.S. officials described as a response to Iranian targeting of American warships during Project Freedom and the ongoing blockade. This is the pattern you need to hold on to through the rest of this story. Talks, a pause, an incident at sea, and then escalation again. It has repeated itself in slightly different forms multiple times throughout 2026. And every single time, the fast boats are somewhere near the center of it. The assassination of Khamenei didn't just remove one man, it triggered what Wikipedia's sourced entry on the 2026 Iranian leadership crisis describes as an unprecedented succession crisis, because the strikes that killed him also killed more than 40 other Iranian officials in the same window. According to CBS News, cited in that same sourced timeline, Ali Larijani, who held the position of Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, appeared to emerge as the de facto overall leader in the immediate aftermath, in a role that CBS reported had reportedly been prearranged by Khamenei himself days before his death. But Larijani didn't last either. According to Wikipedia's sourced entry on his death, Larijani was himself assassinated in Tehran on 17th of March 2026 in a separate Israeli airstrike that killed at least 3 people alongside him, making him the most senior Iranian official killed after Khamenei. Larijani had presided over the crackdown on Iranian protests that had been building through late 2025 and into 2026, and he had been described by critics as the mastermind behind what's referred to in that same source timeline as the 2026 Iran massacres of protesters, a background detail that made him a specific, deliberate target rather than incidental collateral in a broader campaign. Eventually, according to that simple English Wikipedia summary of the assassination, an interim leadership council formed to manage the transition, and Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was named to succeed his father as the 3rd Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic, officially taking the position on 8th of March 2026. The reaction inside Iran, according to Wikipedia's sourced entry on reactions to the assassination, was immediate and largely orchestrated by the state. 40 days of official mourning, a wave of public holidays, and state broadcasting describing Khamenei's death as martyrdom rather than defeat. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian called the killing a great crime that would not go unanswered, according to that same sourced reporting. And the emotional aftershocks weren't confined to Iran's borders. The Washington Post reported that on the 4th of July 2026, months after the assassination, tens of thousands of mourners still streamed on foot to the Grand Mosalla religious complex in Tehran to commemorate Khamenei, a scale of public mourning that underscored just how much his death continued to shape the national mood well into the summer. Al Jazeera's own reporting on the operation noted that the CIA had shared location intelligence with Israel that reportedly moved the timing of the strike forward, a detail that speaks to just how tightly coordinated the American and Israeli roles in the opening strike actually were. Let's talk about what these boats actually are, because Speedboat undersells what Iran has built. In late May 2026, Iran's IRGC Navy unveiled a new missile-armed fast attack craft called the 27 Rajab, named, according to Iranian state outlet Mer News, after a significant date in the Islamic calendar. According to Iranian military claims reported by Hindustan Times and Times Now, the vessel uses a trimaran hull, a 3-pontoon design meant to improve stability at high speed, and is claimed to be capable of reaching up to 100 knots, or roughly 185 kilometers per hour, while carrying 2 long-range naval cruise missiles with an advertised range of around 700 kilometers. It's worth being honest here. Those performance figures come from Iranian sources, and independent observers have not verified them. Iran has a long history of overstating weapons capabilities for propaganda purposes, so treat those specific numbers with appropriate skepticism. What is verified is that the boat exists, it was publicly unveiled, and it represents Iran continuing to invest in exactly this category of weapon, even in the middle of a war that has devastated the rest of its navy. So how do you fight an enemy like that? How does the most powerful navy on Earth deal with thousands of small, cheap, hidden boats that can appear out of nowhere in a 20-mile wide shipping lane? According to Fox News, President Trump gave a very direct answer in a Truth Social post published in mid-April 2026. He said any Iranian boats approaching the blockade would be immediately eliminated using the same system of kill that we use against the drug dealers on boats at sea. It is quick and brutal. That is a direct, on-the-record quote from a sitting U.S. president, comparing a potential military confrontation with a state actor's navy to an entirely different American military campaign, the ongoing strikes against drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. It's also worth understanding just how far Iran's fast boat problem has pushed American military planners to look for unconventional answers. According to reporting from Asia Times, published in April 2026, there have been calls inside the Trump administration to bring the A-10 Warthog, an aging, slow, heavily armored attack aircraft originally designed in the 1970s specifically to hunt tanks, back into more active use against Iran's speedboats and patrol craft. That report noted that additional A-10 squadrons, including aircraft from the 107th Fighter Squadron at Selfridge Air National Guard Base in Michigan and the 190th Fighter Squadron at Gowan Field in Idaho, remained operational and could reportedly triple the number of A-10s in theater from around 30 up to more than 90 aircraft, if reactivated. The appeal, according to that reporting, is straightforward. The A-10 carries a 30mm Gatling gun firing armor-piercing ammunition, giving it exactly the kind of low-altitude, slow and steady firepower that's well-suited to picking off small, fast boats in tight, congested waters like the Strait of Hormuz in a way that faster jets built for high-altitude combat simply aren't optimized for. The Asia Times report also noted that the U.S. Air Force, which has spent years trying to retire the A-10 fleet entirely in favor of newer aircraft, would likely resist any push to expand its role again, an internal service disagreement playing out quietly in the background of the wider war. That comparison is worth sitting with for a second because it's genuinely unusual. Since September 2025, according to Fox News reporting, U.S. Southern Command has carried out dozens of lethal strikes against small boats linked to drug cartels, killing more than 160 people and destroying dozens of vessels in that campaign alone. Those operations rely on persistent surveillance, rapid identification, and precision strikes against small, fast targets, which sounds, on paper, almost exactly like what would be needed against Iran's fast boat fleet. But there's a massive difference underneath that surface-level similarity, and Nadimi, the Washington Institute analyst, spelled it out clearly to Fox News. In the Caribbean, the U.S. is hitting non-state criminal actors with essentially no ability to shoot back. In the Strait of Hormuz, it would be confronting an organized, state-backed military. Boats that, according to Nadimi, likely carry rockets, anti-ship missiles, and shoulder-fired anti-aircraft systems known as man-pads. We can assume many of these boats carry systems like man-pads, he told Fox News. That single sentence changes the entire risk calculation. A drug boat can't shoot down a helicopter. An armed IRGC fast attack craft potentially can. And this is where Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth enters the story. In a video statement covered by Fox News, Hegseth directly warned Iranian leadership to choose wisely on whether to accept a peace deal with the United States, telling Iran, in his words, that American forces were locked and loaded. That phrase, locked and loaded, was a deliberate public signal that the United States was prepared to escalate further if Iran didn't move toward a settlement. It's the kind of language you don't hear often from a sitting Secretary of Defense, and it underlines just how seriously Washington was taking the ongoing risk posed by Iran's surviving fast boat fleet, even after months of American and Israeli air power had already devastated the rest of Iran's military. So, did the United States actually go after the boats directly? Yes, and this is the part of the story with the clearest documentation. According to Wikipedia's sourced timeline of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, on 26 June 2026, CENTCOM reported that it had carried out retaliatory strikes on Iranian military targets following an Iranian attack on a commercial vessel called the Ever Lovely. CENTCOM's own statement, cited in that sourced timeline, said the strikes hit Iranian infrastructure linked to missile and drone capabilities, coastal radar systems, and locations, including sites on Qeshm Island and elsewhere along Iran's southern coast. That same wave of strikes specifically targeted more than 60 IRGC small boats in and around the Strait of Hormuz, according to reporting from the International Crisis Group's own tracking of the flashpoint, which cited a CENTCOM statement describing the goal as degrading Iran's ability to continue attacking international commerce. The IRGC, in response, claimed it had retaliated by striking 85 what it called important U.S. military facilities across Bahrain and Kuwait, a claim that, notably, has not been independently verified in the same way the CENTCOM strikes were, and Iran's own parliamentary speaker made separate, competing claims about what actually happened during that exchange. It's also worth remembering just how much of Iran's remaining leverage in the Persian Gulf runs directly through the same geography its speedboats operate in. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just militarily significant, it's an economic choke point that a huge share of global oil shipments have to physically pass through, which is exactly why Iran has repeatedly threatened and repeatedly followed through on closing it during this war, and exactly why the U.S. Treasury Department reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil exports the moment Iran's forces struck those tankers in July. That back and forth between military strikes and economic sanctions has become its own parallel track running alongside the naval fighting, and it helps explain why the Pentagon has been so focused on the fast boat threat specifically. Because as long as those thousands of small, hidden vessels remain capable of striking a single tanker, the economic pressure the blockade is designed to put on Tehran can just as easily be turned back around and used to threaten global energy markets instead. That's an important pattern to notice throughout this entire conflict. CENTCOM tends to release specific, named figures. Iran's state media and IRGC statements tend to be more sweeping, harder to verify, and sometimes directly contradicted by CENTCOM afterward. That's not a judgment on which side is telling the truth in every instance. It's simply an observation about how each side communicates, and it matters when you're trying to figure out what's actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz on any given day. Because the fighting didn't stop after that June exchange. According to Wikipedia's sourced summary of the ongoing crisis, on 7th of July 2026, two more tankers, the Qatari-owned LNG carrier Al Rekayat and the Saudi-flagged supertanker Wedyan, were struck by projectiles while transiting the strait. Both ships were damaged. Al Rekayat had to be evacuated after a fire broke out in its engine room, putting the vessel at risk of exploding entirely. Qatar publicly accused Iran of being behind the attack, and even Iranian state media suggested Iran's own responsibility, though Tehran never issued an official claim. Less than 24 hours later, the IRGC Navy struck a third vessel in the strait. In response, the U.S. Treasury Department reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil exports that had briefly been lifted under something called the Islamabad Memorandum, and CENTCOM launched another wave of strikes on Iranian military sites near the Strait of Hormuz. Then, early on 12th of July, according to that same sourced Wikipedia timeline, the IRGC Navy formally declared the strait closed again, this time claiming it had fired warning shots at a ship attempting to cross what it called an unauthorized route. Days later, CENTCOM accused Iran of striking a Cyprus-flagged container ship, the GFS Galaxy, causing heavy damage to its engine room. The crew, which included 11 Indian nationals, abandoned ship in a lifeboat. 10 were rescued. One sailor from the city of Pune in India went missing and was later confirmed dead on 14th of July when his body was recovered by the Omani Navy. A grim, very human reminder that behind every one of these strike statistics is a real crew on a real ship, caught in the middle of a war they had nothing to do with. In response to that attack, the United States launched further strikes against Iranian missile batteries, air defense systems, and additional IRGC targets. By late July, something interesting started happening. A split inside Iran's own military and political establishment over whether to keep fighting at all. According to Zero Hedge's reporting, which cited the Iranian outlet Hamshahri, IRGC officials were publicly boasting that Iran's speedboat fleet remained fully intact and capable of what Hamshahri described as swarm attacks in the Strait of Hormuz. Hamshahri reportedly wrote that the combination of speedboats, naval mines, cruise and ballistic missiles, and drones had completed what it called the puzzle of Iran's strategic encirclement of the Strait of Hormuz. That's a bold, defiant claim from Iranian state-aligned media, and it's exactly the kind of statement that should be flagged as unverified, because it comes from a source with an obvious interest in projecting strength, not from an independent military assessment. But at the very same time, according to that same Zero Hedge report, a very different voice was speaking up from inside Iran's own military history. Brigadier General Hossein Alai, who was actually the first commander of the IRGC Navy and a former senior Iranian defense official, publicly called for an end to the war with the United States. Al-Ayei, who served during the brutal Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, said, and this is a direct quote reported by Zero Hedge, "In war, while it is true that Iran defends itself, stands firm, and strikes back at its enemy, the very existence of war is to the detriment of the Iranian people." He argued that Iran's real victory would come from restoring peace, not from continuing the fight. He also claimed that a negotiated agreement had already put pressure on Israel to stop daily strikes on Lebanon, something he described as a very big victory in itself. But according to that same reporting, hardline factions inside Iran, including figures who wanted negotiations with the United States cut off entirely, were pushing in the opposite direction, especially after military clashes resumed on 7 July. So where does that leave things right now, heading into August 2026? According to CENTCOM's own public statements posted directly to social media and picked up by multiple outlets, the naval blockade against Iran remains active and is being, in CENTCOM's words, strictly enforced. As of 3rd August, CENTCOM reported it had redirected 44 commercial vessels, disabled 2, and boarded 2 more. A separate CENTCOM statement, reported by Just the News on 31st July, pushed back publicly against a set of claims made by the IRGC following what the report described as the latest pounding by U.S. air power against Iranian targets. CENTCOM specifically disputed an IRGC claim that the Strait of Hormuz remained dangerous only because of American and Israeli actions, countering that the actual danger to commercial vessels and their civilian crews came from IRGC threats and attempted attacks. CENTCOM also flatly denied a separate IRGC claim that 3 US F-35 stealth fighters and 3 other aircraft had been destroyed during a recent Iranian attack on an American airbase, stating plainly, no US aircraft were destroyed or damaged in recent attempted Iranian attacks. 2 competing narratives running in parallel, and no fully independent verification of either one beyond the statements themselves. An open-source daily tracker of the conflict, updated on 7th of August 2026 and covering what it labeled Day 161 of the war, adds even more texture to where things stand. It cited Forbes reporting claiming the war has depleted crucial elements of Iran's weapons stockpiles, a claim President Trump has publicly denied. It cited a Hamer Intel report repeating CENTCOM's figure of 49 ships redirected under the ongoing blockade. And it flagged something genuinely worth paying attention to, a warning of coordinated attacks by Iraqi militias and Yemen's Houthi movement against Saudi ports, airports, and energy infrastructure, arriving just hours after a Houthi strike wounded 11 people in the Saudi city of Najran. According to that same tracker, a Saudi official suggested this coordination could actually reflect an internal power struggle inside Iran's own security establishment. The idea being that a divided, cornered Iranian leadership might either be ordering these proxy attacks deliberately or simply losing the ability to prevent its regional allies from acting on their own. That same source also reported something genuinely difficult to hear and important for understanding the human cost sitting underneath all of this military strategy. According to Iran Human Rights, cited in that tracker, at least 444 executions were carried out across Iran between January and July of 2026, including 71 in July alone. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reportedly warned of a sharp escalation in the use of capital punishment inside Iran, describing it as a tool being used to intimidate the population and suppress internal dissent during wartime. The breakdown for July alone included 36 executions for murder, 26 for drug-related offenses, 8 tied to security charges, and 1 for rape, with 6 of those executed identified specifically as protesters. Across the full year-to-date total, the figure of 444 reportedly includes 12 women, 17 foreign nationals, 80 members of ethnic minorities, and 28 protesters. The UN's rights chief separately stated on 5th of August that at least 56 people had been executed specifically on national security-related charges. This isn't a side story. It's part of the same picture. A regime under military and economic pressure from the naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, apparently tightening its grip domestically at the exact same time. So what does all of this add up to? On one side, you have a U.S. military campaign that has, according to its own public claims, sunk more than 150 of Iran's larger naval vessels, imposed a blockade that's reportedly cost Iran billions of dollars in lost oil revenue, and struck dozens of the smaller fast boats directly, including that wave of more than 60 small craft hit in the 26 June strikes. On the other side, you have a fleet that was purpose-built decades ago to survive exactly this kind of pressure, dispersed, hidden in tunnels, sometimes tucked inside ordinary buildings, numbering somewhere in the low thousands according to independent analysts, with Iran's own state-aligned media now publicly claiming that fleet remains fully intact and ready for swarm attacks. Somewhere in between those two claims is almost certainly the truth, and neither side has an obvious incentive to be fully transparent about it. What happens next seems to hinge on a genuinely fragile set of negotiations. Trump has, at different points, described talks with Iran as making great progress, and at other points has authorized fresh strikes within days of saying so. Inside Iran, you have a retired IRGC Navy founder publicly arguing for peace, while hardline factions push to keep fighting, and while executions inside the country climb to levels the United Nations is calling alarming. Outside Iran, you have proxy forces, Iraqi militias, the Houthis in Yemen, apparently coordinating attacks on Saudi infrastructure in ways that Saudi officials themselves aren't entirely sure whether Tehran ordered or simply failed to stop. And sitting in the middle of literally all of it still are the boats. Thousands of small, cheap, fast, hidden vessels in and around one of the most strategically vital waterways on the planet that neither months of American air power nor a full-scale naval blockade have been able to fully eliminate. It's a genuinely strange kind of military standoff, one side possessing overwhelming, demonstrated firepower, and the other side betting everything on speed, dispersal, and sheer numbers in a stretch of water only 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. Whether that bet pays off for Iran, or whether the next round of CENTCOM strikes finally breaks the back of that fleet for good, is genuinely still an open question as of this recording. It's worth stepping back, too, on just how unusual it is for the international community to be reacting to an assassination like Khamenei's at all, let alone one carried out by a close U.S. ally acting on American intelligence. According to Wikipedia's sourced entry on the reactions to the killing, foreign governments and international organizations responded with a mix of condemnations and calls for restraint, while demonstrations broke out among Shia communities well beyond Iran's borders, including the scenes NPR described in Baghdad's Sadr city district, where mourners held up images of the slain supreme leader during a symbolic funeral the day after his death. NPR's own reporting placed the operation in a longer historical context, noting that it came roughly 6 years after an earlier high-profile American strike on a senior Iranian military figure, and it raised, in NPR's words, renewed questions about the United States assassinating foreign leaders as a tool of policy, a debate that clearly hasn't gone away, even months later as the war has ground on through blockade, tanker strikes, and now this drawn-out standoff over Iran's surviving speedboat fleet in the Strait of Hormuz. Before we wrap up, it's worth being upfront about where the shakier parts of this story sit. The exact size of Iran's remaining speedboat fleet, the 3,000 to 4,000 figure, comes from one named analyst's estimate, not from an official U.S. government count, and Iran itself has never published a real number. The performance claims about the new 27 Rajab attack craft, including that reported top speed and missile range, come directly from Iranian sources and have not been independently confirmed. The competing claims from the 26 June exchange, CENTCOM's version of the strikes versus the IRGC's claim of 85 retaliatory hits on U.S. facilities in Bahrain and Kuwait, have never been reconciled into a single agreed account. And the suggestion that Houthi and Iraqi militia coordination reflects an internal Iranian power struggle is, by the reporting's own admission, informed speculation from a single Saudi official, not a confirmed intelligence assessment. Everything else in this script, the blockade dates, the vessel interception numbers, the direct quotes from Trump, Hegseth, and Nadimi, the strikes on Khamenei and later on Ali Larijani, the tanker attacks and the human rights figures, traces back to named reporting from outlets including the BBC, Al Jazeera, NPR, The Washington Post, Fox News, and CENTCOM's own public statements, along with a sourced open-source timeline that cross-references those same outlets. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Iran built this speedboat strategy assuming that sheer numbers and dispersal could outlast even the most powerful navy on Earth. The United States is betting that persistent surveillance and precision strikes, the same approach used against drug boats in the Caribbean, can eventually be adapted to work against a state military hiding in tunnels along the Strait of Hormuz. Which side do you think actually has the advantage in that kind of fight? The side with overwhelming firepower, or the side that simply refuses to be a single, easy target? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching.